largest gatherings in American history took place in Washington, D.C. On that day, 1 million. On October 16, 1995, one of the largest gatherings in American history took place in Washington, D.C. On that day, 1 million African-American men stood together and considered how to improve their lives and their communities. They arrived by car, by air, by bus, and even by boat. Some were rich, others were not, and many were poor. From sunrise to sunset, 1 million African-American men listened to speakers, conversed among themselves, and meditated on their individual and collective responsibilities. The high point of the march was the address of its principal organizer, Nation of Islam Minister Louis Farrakhan. At the end of a day of forceful admonitions and peaceful fellowship, 1 million men departed Washington, determined to perform deeds of atonement and community service. This gathering was in sharp contrast to the masses of rioters and looters in Los Angeles after the controversial acquittal of police officers in the Rodney King videotaped beating case. The quest of African Americans is to have their views converted into law. They have consistently reminded their fellow Americans in Congress that simple freedom from bondage is not enough. Equal protection of the laws is insufficient. The first 3 African Americans to sit in Congress were elected in 1868. Now 20 African American men and 11 African American women sit in this legislative body, all advocating a more open and equitable society. Perhaps the career of General Colin Powell, retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is a sign of what is possible in an open opportunity society. The same was true for black airmen in World War II. Better opportunities were sought through direct political action by the Reverend Jesse Jackson and the late mayor of Chicago, Harold Washington.
Our time has come all the way from the State House to the courthouse to the White House. Our time has come. God bless you.
I have been urged by the earnest pleas of thousands of people to enter this race. Therefore, I hereby declare my candidacy. You want him? You got him.
Equal opportunities are as much a just reward for military service as it is a consequence of political activity. Heavyweight boxing champion Muhammad Ali was perhaps the most famous American objecting to the war in Vietnam. He was stripped of his title for 3 years, but became an even greater hero to many who supported his idea of non-involvement. Muhammad Ali excited millions of people with his boxing skills and stimulated worldwide discussions when he refused military service because of his religious convictions. In his best years, Ali's fights were spectacles of awesome athletic ability and raised interest in boxing to a new international high. His career was a brilliant combination of unmatched boxing skill and religious fidelity.
We look at Miss America, we see white. We look at Miss World, we see white. We look at Miss Universe, we see white. Even Tarzan, the king of the jungle in back Africa, he's white.
During his brief but extremely active career, Malcolm X became well known for his unsparing criticism of America and its values, including his fellow African Americans. He urged them to avoid negative elements in their public and private lives. He was a man of the people and welcomed any opportunity to share his views.
We teach you to obey the law. We teach you to carry yourselves in a respectable way. But at the same time, we teach you that anyone who puts his hand on you, do your best to see that he doesn't put it on anybody else.
Malcolm X urged African Americans to defend themselves when faced with unprovoked physical assault. This is quite different from the ideologically motivated violence that has been a standard feature of African American life for nearly a century and a half. Sadly enough, violence, official and unofficial, was employed to make slaves work against their will for 250 years. These steady, unprovoked attacks drove hundreds of black families to the North, searching for relief from oppression and for opportunities to make a decent living. Unfortunately, they were followed by many of their Southern tormentors, who became their economic competitors, thus perpetuating a vicious cycle. This map graphically illustrates the extent and location of hate groups. Whether the Ku Klux Klan or a variety of fascist and neo-Nazi groups, these ideologically driven bands are anti-black, anti-Semitic, and frequently anti-Catholic. These groups are generally white supremacists. They sometimes consider themselves citizen soldiers, such as the Posse Comitatus. They believe that only they deserve maximum benefits from democracy. Small clusters of these super patriot groups are found from coast to coast. Most of them, however, are located along the traditional path of black migration, that is, along the Atlantic seaboard and the Mississippi Valley routes north. Rosa Parks and the Reverend Martin Luther King devoted their lives to peaceful change and the cause for social justice. Through their dedication to nonviolence, they have represented the best moral tradition of African Americans.
We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Even though Dr. King's life ended violently, African Americans' commitment to nonviolence remains strong. Today's Ku Klux Klan and Aryan Nation groups are echoes of an earlier period in race relations, an era of poor educational facilities for blacks and of random but extreme physical attacks, including brutal mutilation. The efforts of these groups to control through violence is a resurrection of habits developed during slavery. Thurgood Marshall was the chief lawyer for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He and an army of colleagues from both white and black America spent a generation in court attacking statutory racism. The main reason for African Americans being involved in military service had to do with making democracy work for them. During World War II, black communities engaged in double V campaigns, victory at home, victory abroad. In this war, some 700,000 African Americans served in the armed forces. Some 4,000 African American females were in the Women's Auxiliary Corps. Despite prejudice, a few excelled, such as Brigadier General Benjamin O. Davis, Sr. and Colonel Chappie James. The same is true of the 600 Tuskegee pilots who formed the 99th Pursuit Squadron. These lawyers persuaded the courts that separation of the races in public facilities was wrong and unconstitutional. In the 1890s, Booker T. Washington promoted an acceptance of black exclusion from politics in exchange for social peace. Most blacks worked as sharecroppers in the fields of cane and cotton. A very demanding code of racial etiquette was enforced, with African Americans required to show extreme deference and little hostility to a system that had reminded them of slavery. During the African Americans' first war for freedom, some 180,000 served in the military and acquitted themselves with valor. Military service for most was the experience of real freedom. Frederick Douglass was a leader of those recruiting free blacks for Union Army service. The Peace of Reconstruction did allow freedmen to enter the political system. Between 1868 and 1900, some 22 blacks were elected to public office. Over 1,000 were elected to state and local offices. At least 2 states had commissioners of education. One had a lieutenant governor, Oscar J. Dunn, Louisiana. Perhaps their greatest achievement was persuading the ex-Confederate states to adopt constitutions without property or religious qualifications for voting. Pictured here are 5 generations of a slave family. Recent studies have shown that in slavery, many individuals went to great lengths to maintain contact with family members. When slavery ended, literally thousands upon thousands of freed people searched for relatives who had been sold away from them during bondage. Many of the early freedom novels developed a family search theme. In the era of slavery itself, many individuals could not accept their bondage and ran away. Then after freedom, they looked for relatives left behind. An untold number of mothers were sold apart from their children. After emancipation, parents and children crisscrossed the South in search of each other. The same was true of couples who considered themselves husband and wife before slavery ended. Most of them were not successful in locating their parents or any other relatives. They simply rebuilt their lives in the presence of new people. The original African-American family breakup took place in Africa. Enslaved Africans first were given numbers. The new names came later. This slave ship overhead view is of the HMS Brooke, one of the larger slave-carrying vessels. Some ships specialized in tight packing, some did not. All suffered losses of their captives, each of whom was expected to be accounted for. Taking the place of people in international commerce, African art is now a valued commodity. It is a counterpoint to the horrors of the slave business. What we now call art, the statues, masks, staffs, and the like, were all created for some functional purpose. Seldom did African artists produce an object as art. The object was a tool to do something. Slave forts were scattered along the west coast of Africa, from Fort Gorée near Senegal to Fort George in Ghana. When constructed of stone, these forts usually had a huge underground holding area. Some dungeons could hold at least 1,000 captives. In preparation for the overseas market, slaves were generally branded with symbols of the company underwriting his or her purchase, and also given an identification number for greater ease of management aboard ship. As a matter of record, some slaves wound up with 3 different markings on them: the shipping company sign, the captain's number, and the new owner's number. For 400 years, 4 continents extracted profits from the triangular trade. Africans enslaved in the Americas were forced to make the forests and fields turn profits from tobacco, cotton, and hemp. Each side of the Atlantic had its slave port: Liverpool and Bristol, Bordeaux and Nantes, Rotterdam, Madrid, Seville, Lisbon. In the Americas, Charleston, Savannah, Annapolis, Bahia, Port-au-Prince, Jamaica. The acquisitive spirit of capitalism gave transatlantic slavery a vigor and destructiveness unmatched in human history. The linkage between the African cultural system of trading people as things and European colonial systems that traded things for people resulted in literally millions of individuals being transported to the Western Hemisphere. This map is a view of pre-colonial trade routes connecting the interior of Africa with its northern coast. These routes were very popular and profitable. Camel caravans loaded with European goods often encountered African caravans carrying salt and gold. It was in this network of trade that the great African kingdom arose in the west: ancient Guinea, Mali, and Songhai. Timbuktu was the most famous city of the Sahara. Wherever Islam was practiced, its African followers built mosques. The mosque shown is in Timbuktu. At least 22 countries have adopted Islam. Shown here is a city in Songhai. Whether town or city, traditional African communities were generally very safe and peaceful. There are accounts of people leaving valuables in a public place where they remained untouched for months. What does all of this mean? This rapid overview of the African American experience in the United States may mean something slightly different to each viewer. As the Spanish proverb says, no matter how much we think we are like one another, each head is also a world unto itself. In this all too brief film, we have presented the world of African Americans as seen by the contributors to this presentation. We believe that Howard University has functioned as a legal and social conscience tutor to America, and we hope that this presentation accurately reflects the scholarly community that is Howard. We believe our presence is both a source of the moral energy that fuels the quest for social justice and the test of whether or not our nation can live up to its highest ideals. Washington, D.C. is not only the seat of government, but also the home of the capstone of black higher education in America, Howard University, the flagship of an armada of over 100 historically black colleges. The fitting symbol of this university is Founders Library. Howard Hall was the first building, and today, in 93 buildings, some 700 professors teach 10,000 students who come from nearly every state in the Union and from many countries around the world. Howard University hosts hundreds of visitors each year. It is called the Mecca and celebrated the world over for the quality and diversity of the education it offers. Howard students learn from their work in laboratories, libraries, training rooms, and studios, and many have gone on to achieve prominence in their respective fields. It is fitting that we end this presentation with the words of one of the students attending this institution.
I would be willing to put my education up against anybody else's education in all the world.